we know about Rome? Well, like most great empires, they emerge initially at the borderlands of another cultural empire, okay? So these are the Etruscans. And the Etruscans are very similar to the Mycenaean Greeks. And as you can see, they're expanding throughout the Italian peninsula. Now, the thing about empires is that eventually the people become lazy, arrogant, and stupid. And so what they do is they get people to fight for them. So the Romans are here. And as you can see, this is the borderlands, and the entire area is surrounded by great warriors. This is a poor region, and so they're always fighting for resources. So the Romans get recruited as mercenaries. And over time, what will happen is that they will start to emerge as the great power in the Italian peninsula. And at this point in history, this is really important, they're surrounded by lots of different people that are like them, and they're warlike. So they triumph because they become the most warlike of everyone, okay? Their entire society is based on war. This is Etruscan civilization, and as you can see, it is very advanced. The Etruscan civilization is heavily in contact with the Egyptians and the Greeks, and as well as people around them, because they are seafaring people. And this is a civilization that will most heavily influence the Romans. As you can see, the Etruscans are always at war as well. And then as they become wealthier, they will recruit the Romans to fight for them. This is not a great map, but what this map shows you is the gradual expansion of Rome. So at first, as you can see, it is actually at the most disadvantaged location because it's surrounded by enemies. It is on flat land, and so it's not easily defensible, and it's not really by the coast, and therefore it's hard for it to trade. But because it is in such a disadvantaged position, it is forced to be the most martial, the most violent, the most militaristic, the most aggressive, and their culture evolves around that. And slowly over time, they're able to conquer the entire Italian peninsula and then expand to the Mediterranean. Okay, so this is another map that shows you Rome and how it's going to slowly expand over time. The way that it expands is through military conquest and then by building roads. And this is very impressive because if you've ever been to Italy, it's very hilly. So there's a tremendous effort to build roads. But once they build the roads, they're able to consolidate and navigate their empire. This is a map that shows you the geography of Italy. As you can see, it's very mountainous, and there are not many rivers, which tells us it's very poor. And because it's very poor, the people tend to be very unified, very aggressive, and they have a deep egalitarianism, because only by working together can you ultimately triumph over the other people, okay? So this is a main characteristic about Rome in the early days that you must remember. It is poor, it is small, okay, and it is unified, so everyone knows each other. And so because of its geographic characteristics, we emerge its concept of liberty. All right? And its concept of liberty is obedience to the fathers, to history, to culture, because only by doing so can you survive as a people. Now what's interesting about this is it's a different concept from the Greeks. The Greeks believe that what liberty is the right to speak your mind in front of others. And as such, the major difference between the Greeks and the Romans is in Greece, citizenship is passed on from family to family. But in Rome, citizenship can be earned, okay? It's an open citizenship system. Why? Because if you just obey the fathers, the laws, the customs, then you can be a Roman citizen. And as such, what's going to happen is that as Rome expands, it's going to incorporate different people into its culture. And as a result, Rome has an advantage that Athens and Sparta doesn't have. Rome can always replenish its soldiers. And as such, it can afford to lose war after war after war, but as it does so, it gets stronger and stronger because it's learning with each defeat. Okay, and that is the secret to Rome's ultimate victory. The heart and center of Roman society is the Senate. This is where the leading families come together to discuss the fate of Rome. And at this time in history, when Rome is poor, this is not a problem because everyone knows each other and there's no real inequality, therefore there can be no corruption. And so these fathers, the senators, are representing the best interests of all Romans. But over time, as Rome becomes wealthier and wealthier, this becomes a huge problem because as Rome develops more wealth, guess who gets all the wealth? These guys, okay? So we'll see this later. As Rome gets wealthier, Rome also becomes much more corrupt. All right, so the Greeks, the fighting system is the hoplites. The Romans use something called the legions. Now, there are some major differences between these two fighting techniques, even though for their time they are the most advanced. As you can see, the Greek hoplites are heavily armored, okay? And as such, each hoplite needs to buy his own armor, which means that hoplites tend to be small landowners, okay? They have a bit of wealth. The legionnaires can be poor because it doesn't actually require that much armor to be a legionnaire. Okay, that's the first thing. Second thing is that it actually takes a lot of training to be a hoplite. You basically have to spend years and years honing your skills because you fight in formation. The legionnaire, you don't need that much training, okay? You can actually go straight into battle. And the third major difference is that, as you can see, the hoplites, they are using heavy armor, shields, and helmets. The legionnaires are much lighter. The reason why is the legionnaires were developed to fight in a mountainous region. So they need to be able to climb, to hike up mountains in formation, whereas the Greeks are fighting more on flat land. Okay? So over time, what will happen is the legionnaires will overwhelm the hoplites. This is a typical Roman peasant. He's spending most of his time farming, and when it's required of him, he goes to war. Okay, he's not a full-time soldier. The Greeks and the Romans will fight a series of wars. So as the Romans are expanding, they go closer and closer to the coast. And here are a lot of Greek colonies. And the Greeks are losing to the Romans, so they call for help from the compatriots across the sea. And a king named Pyrrhus of Epirus, he decides to take advantage of this opportunity to go conquer Italy, okay? So he and his hoplites sail over to Greece, and they are destroying the Romans. Battle after battle, Pyrrhus is defeating the Romans. And then he finally says, you know what? If I win one more battle, I'm going to have no more soldiers, okay? And that shows you the difference between Greek fighting versus Roman fighting. Greek fighting uses specialized forces that can wither over time, whereas the Romans can just keep on replenishing their forces, okay? So the Romans don't actually win that many battles, but they win most of their wars. Okay, now, as the Romans are expanding, they eventually reach the Mediterranean. And so now they start developing a navy in order to trade with other nations like Egypt and Greece. This comes in conflict with the Carthaginians. And at this time, the main power in the Mediterranean are the Carthaginians. Now, and they will fight a war that lasts decades, 100 years. And ultimately, Rome will triumph. And the main reason why that Rome triumphs, and this is really important for you guys to understand, is the main difference between Carthage and Rome is Carthage is rich, Rome is poor, okay? Why? What does this matter? Because if you're rich, what you can do is hire mercenaries to fight the war for you, and that's what Carthage does. But Rome is poor, therefore they must use their own citizens to fight the war, okay? And so over time, the citizens become much tougher, much more unified. Whereas the Carthaginians, they become more corrupt, they become much more decadent. And because the Romans are more invested in the war, they will fight to the end, whereas the Carthaginians are business people, they're traders, okay? They're very known for their sharp business skills. And so they do a cost-benefit analysis and be like, you know what, this war is gonna cost us more than if we just surrender, okay? So the Carthaginians surrender the First Punic War, they surrender the Second Punic War, and the Third Punic War, guess what happens? They're gonna be wiped out by the Romans, okay? So that's what the Roman mentality is. If we fight you, we'll fight you to the death. And if we beat you, we will kill every one of you. Okay? That's just the Roman war mentality, and that's why they ultimately triumph in the end. Okay, so this is another map that shows you the conflict between the Carthaginians and the Romans. This is the Second Punic War, okay? So Carthage over here, it's expanded to Spain, and there are lots of silver mines in Spain. Rome right now, it's still pretty small, okay? But again, because the Romans are dedicated towards war, that's the only thing they know, that's the only thing they're good at, okay? They will eventually triumph over the Carthaginians. We actually don't know that much about the history of Rome, okay? But the most famous episode during the Second Punic War is when a Carthaginian general named Hannibal Barca, okay, he's in Spain and he decides he's going to go destroy Rome. And the way he does it is by crossing the Alps, okay? So these are Alp mountains, and for the longest time, the Romans thought that this was a natural barrier. And what Hannibal Barca will do is he will cross the Alps with his war elephants and his army, land in Italy, and start attacking Rome. And in 3 decisive battles, Hannibal will destroy the entire Roman army. Okay? He will wipe out the entire Roman army. And at this point in history, Rome needs to surrender. Okay, so Hannibal sends an envoy to the Senate and tells them, I've destroyed every single one of your soldiers, you have no more army. Therefore, I am willing to talk peace terms. And the Senate is like, screw you, come get us. Okay? And this marks a turning point in Roman history. So let's look over some of the major events. This is Hannibal crossing the Alps, okay? One of the most famous military feats in human history. This is the Battle of Trebia, one of the first major battles, where even though Hannibal is undermanned and he's in enemy territory, what he will do is he will use a series of brilliant military maneuvers to ambush his enemies. Okay, so these are the Romans. As you can see, what's going to happen is the Carthaginians, their horsemen, lies in the marsh, and then they will sneak up and destroy the Romans from the rear, okay? That's the first major battle. This is the Battle of Lake Trasimene, and the same thing basically happens where the Romans are crossing, then Hannibal ambushes them from the hills, okay? The second major battle. And this is the most famous battle. This is called the Battle of Cannae. Okay, and this is what we call a double-envelopment strategy, where what will happen is that the two armies meet, and then Hannibal will send his cavalry on the wings. And then they will envelop the Roman army, and then they will slaughter everyone, okay? So Romans lose between 50,000 to 100,000 men. Their entire army is wiped out because of this battle, okay? So this is the first phase. Second phase is when the cavalry starts to flank the Romans. And in the third phase, the soldiers come in from behind and trap the Romans and kill everyone, okay? So this is the most famous battle in military history. Now there's a problem with this battle, which is this has never happened before in human history. Remember before we discussed the idea that in China, one of the most common military strategies is behind the river strategy, okay? So you force your men to go to a river, and now the enemy is approaching them, and they have no choice but to fight to the end, because otherwise they'll drown, okay? If you can see this situation, it's very similar. The Romans are in a very similar situation where they're being surrounded by enemies on all sides, right? So at this time, what should happen theoretically is they become energized, and the entire Roman army goes and fights the Carthaginians and defeats the Carthaginians. Okay, we have examples of that. We don't have an example of, in fact, an entire army in ancient times being surrounded and being slaughtered by the enemy. This is a very strange battle. In fact, if you ask ChatGPT which battles have used double-envelopment strategy, basically you have the Battle of Cannae, okay, we have that, but the next one is 1940 in World War II. Now, the difference, of course, is that by the time you hit the 1940s, you have machine guns, you have tanks. So if you start an enemy, you can destroy your enemy. but not in ancient times, okay? In fact, the closest parallel that we have is the Battle of Marathon. But some historians suggest, okay, so even historians disagree whether or not the Battle of Marathon was actually a double-envelopment strategy. This makes no sense. This battle strategy makes no sense from a military perspective. Also, we can't find the damn place. You would think this is this huge battle, 50,000, 100,000 Romans are dead, there'd be a lot of bodies. We can't find the damn place, okay? Look, there's no archaeological evidence to prove the battle took place. We don't have any evidence. That's kind of strange, okay? Yeah, but maybe it's because of the weather or, we don't know, okay? All right, guys.